A flight attendant mocked a black family's crying baby mid-flight. Seconds later, the father's response left the entire cabin in stunned silence, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He thought hurting a child would make him powerful, but cruelty always circles back. Subscribe if you believe no uniform excuses in humanity. The moment Ethan Merrow's eyes landed on Dr. Adrian Vance, a shift occurred in the air. Quiet, invisible, but thick enough to cut through. It began with a glance, one that lingered a second too long. As Adrian stepped into the premium cabin of Flight 827, his infant son Malik cradled carefully in his left arm, Ethan's posture stiffened behind his perfectly pressed uniform. His jaw twitched and his eyes flicked briefly toward the baby, then to Adrian's face, before snapping back to the cabin door as if he'd seen something offensive. Adrian didn't notice. He was focused entirely on Malik, adjusting the soft blanket around the child's shoulders, checking the air vent above their seat, and carefully settling his carry-on beneath his feet. His movements were deliberate and practiced. Malik had undergone nasal surgery just 2 weeks earlier, and Adrian remained watchful for any sign of discomfort. He gently rocked the boy as he sat down, whispering soothingly into his ear, while the aircraft filled with the murmur of boarding passengers and the occasional chime from the overhead speakers. "Welcome aboard, sir," came a voice to his right. It wasn't Ethan's voice. Another male attendant, Carter Doyle, offered a polite smile and a short nod as he moved past them to assist an elderly passenger. Adrian acknowledged him with a quiet, "Thank you," then returned to adjusting Malik's positioning on his chest. But just as Adrian relaxed into his seat, his son safely nestled against his chest, Ethan approached from the aisle with the sort of purposeful stride that didn't match the early calm of boarding. He stopped beside their row, arms crossed neatly behind his back, and studied them for a moment longer than necessary. His tone, when he finally spoke, was smooth, but hollow. "Will the infant be using any medical equipment during the flight, sir?" Adrian looked up, surprised by the question's phrasing. "Just a straw for nasal hydration," he replied evenly, his voice quiet and patient. "It's pre-sanitized. My son had a recent procedure, and we've cleared it through TSA, and our pediatrician Ethan's lips barely moved." "Very well," he said, but the way he lingered felt more like a challenge than an acknowledgement. He moved on without another word. Adrian furrowed his brow. It was a small interaction, seemingly harmless, but something about the attendant's tone was off. He brushed it aside. His focus needed to stay on Malik. As more passengers boarded, Ethan continued moving through the cabin, offering instructions and checking overhead compartments with military precision. Yet his gaze kept returning, brief flashes in Adrian's direction when Malik coughed softly or wriggled in his father's arms. Each time there was a flicker of annoyance beneath Ethan's neutral expression, subtle but growing. Adrian felt it, a strange pressure, like being watched with scrutiny instead of service. He tried to ignore it. After all, they had a long flight ahead, and Malik had already begun to fidget. The pressurized cabin wasn't kind to recovering sinuses, and Adrian knew the next few hours would require patience and care. Then came the small request. "Excuse me," Adrian said gently, stopping Carter as he passed by. "May I have a sanitizing wipe? I'd like to clean the seat tray before settling the baby." "Of course, sir," Carter responded immediately, reaching into his supply pouch. He handed over the packet without hesitation, offering a reassuring nod. But from across the cabin, Ethan paused mid-step. He watched the exchange in silence, his eyes narrowing slightly before he turned and walked briskly toward the galley. Adrian wiped the tray table carefully, murmuring thanks to Carter and gently laying down a cloth beneath Malik's bottle. The baby gurgled softly, blinking up at the ceiling lights above. It wasn't long before the engines hummed to life and the cabin dimmed in preparation for takeoff. Passengers leaned into their seats, seatbelts clicked shut, and the final safety announcements echoed through the intercom. Adrian adjusted Malik's blanket again, whispering a lullaby he remembered from his own childhood. The motion of the aircraft eased Malik into a light sleep, and for a moment all felt calm. But behind that calm, Ethan moved with purpose. In the galley, he stood alone, his fingers tapping rhythmically against a metal tray. His reflection stared back at him from the polished coffee urn. The image wasn't kind. It showed a man clenched too tightly, jaw stiff, thoughts racing. He muttered under his breath, barely audible. Always a story. Always an exception. Carter passed behind him, breaking the moment. "Hey, you good?" he asked casually, reaching for a water bottle. "Fine," Ethan replied, forcing a neutral tone. "Just making sure everyone's in line." Adrian raised his eyebrows, his tone steady. "I understand safety concerns, but this is a medical device, not a weapon. And my son needs it now, not when we land." The air between them hung thick for a moment. A businessman across the aisle turned slightly, pretending to adjust his seatbelt, but his eyes flicked between the two men. The hum of the engines crescendoed as the plane prepared for takeoff, adding a quiet intensity to the moment. Ethan's mouth tightened, but he offered a small nod. "Very well," he said through clenched teeth. "Just be aware that unauthorized tools may be confiscated if they pose a threat." His words were clipped, sterile. Adrian didn't reply. He turned back to Malik, brushing his son's forehead gently as the infant resumed sipping. But as Ethan walked away, the attendant's gaze lingered longer than necessary. His posture rigid, eyes dull with something unreadable, resentment, perhaps, or something deeper. Carter Doyle approached Ethan near the galley minutes later, nudging him lightly with a paper cup in hand. "Let it go, man," he whispered. "You've got other passengers to worry about." Ethan didn't answer. His hand clenched the tablet he held, knuckles pale. "He thinks he's better than the rest," he muttered. "Polished types like him always get away with everything." Carter's smile faltered. "You're reading too much into this." "It's just a father and a sick kid." But Ethan didn't hear him. His eyes remained locked on the metal glint near row 3, where Adrian now leaned back slightly, unaware of the festering thoughts aimed in his direction. Time ticked on. The cabin settled into a rhythm, beverage carts moved, overhead fans whirred, and passengers slipped into books and headphones. But for Ethan, the image of the straw wouldn't fade. It wasn't about policy anymore. It had become a symbol. Something about the man, the way he spoke with quiet assurance, the effortless authority. Ethan couldn't stand it. And the child, always whining, always demanding attention. He gritted his teeth as Malik let out another soft whimper. His fingers tapped anxiously against the galley counter. The rest of the crew moved on, but Ethan remained restless. He walked past Adrian again, and again. Each time, his glance lingered longer. Each step grew slower. The passengers in the premium cabin began to notice. They didn't say anything, but a subtle shift occurred. Shoulders tensed, eyes lifted briefly from screens, senses sharpened. Adrian noticed the movement, too. He adjusted his seat, offering a polite nod when Ethan passed the third time. No response, just a hard look and a faint twitch in the corner of the man's mouth. Something was off. Deeply off. He turned his attention back to Malik, gently rocking him as he dozed off against his chest, the bottle resting on the tray table. The straw shimmered slightly in the cabin light. Ethan stood by the galley again, unmoving, watching. And in that moment, something inside him shifted, not broken, not snapped, but quietly rearranged, like a lock clicking into place. The metal straw had become more than a tool. It had become the matchstick. Sometimes, the smallest details become the spark that ignites a storm. An hour into the flight, the cabin trembled with a subtle jolt as the aircraft met a patch of turbulence. Overhead compartments creaked faintly, and a few passengers tightened their seatbelts reflexively. In seat 2A, Adrian Vance gently cradled his infant son, Malik, against his chest. The boy stirred uneasily, eyes fluttering open with a soft whimper. Adrian responded with a quiet hum, rocking slightly, his hand brushing soothingly over the child's back. The melody was barely audible, meant only for Malik's comfort, a low, steady rhythm that spoke of security and love. But peace on this flight was a fragile illusion. The curtain separating the galley from the premium cabin rustled, and through it stepped Ethan Marrow, his uniform crisp, smile practiced, but his eyes told a different story. "Sir," Ethan said, his voice overly polite, the edges sharpened by something far less friendly. "May I check that item you used earlier?" He pointed toward the small metal straw resting on Adrian's tray table. Adrian turned slightly, shielding Malik's head with one arm. His expression remained calm, though his voice carried quiet resolve. "It's been sterilized. I carry it for medical reasons, nasal hydration. It's safe." Ethan's smile didn't waver, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. "We can't have passengers bringing unsafe tools aboard," he replied, each word weighted with underlying judgment. Without waiting for permission, he leaned in, arm extending as if to take the straw himself. Adrian pulled the tray closer. "Please don't touch it. I'm a licensed medical professional. That straw is vital for my son's comfort." The tension between the two men began to draw attention. A businessman seated diagonally across glanced up from his magazine, brows furrowed. A teenage boy in the row behind stopped tapping on his game console. His ears perked. Ethan's eyes flicked from the straw to Malik, then back again. The child, now fully awake, gave a soft, distressed cry, his breath wheezing slightly as he shifted. The sound seemed to agitate Ethan further. The steward's face flushed with something unreadable, an emotion that might have been annoyance or something darker. "I'm just trying to ensure everyone's safety," Ethan said, but the lightness in his voice had vanished. The performative professionalism was slipping, like a costume tugged too tightly over a roiling core. "You're escalating a non-issue," Adrian replied, now firmer. "There's no danger here. I've cleared this straw through TSA before. Please, focus on your duties." Ethan's mouth opened as if to retort, but instead he gave a thin-lipped smile, turned sharply, and walked away without another word. The curtain swayed behind him for a beat longer than necessary, as if the very fabric had absorbed his resentment. Adrian exhaled slowly, aware that the small encounter had drawn invisible lines across the cabin. He kissed the top of Malik's head and whispered reassurances, gently pressing the boy's nose to check for pressure buildup. The straw lay untouched, gleaming innocently under the overhead light. Yet Adrian felt something bitter settling in his stomach. It wasn't over. Ethan's expression as he left lingered in his memory. Too calm, too deliberate. Across the aisle, Carter Doyle, another flight attendant, leaned from the galley curtain just long enough to make eye contact with Adrian. His gaze wasn't hostile but concerned, curious, perhaps, or even cautious. Carter disappeared before any word was exchanged, but the silent acknowledgement was enough to confirm Adrian's instinct. Something was wrong. 10 minutes passed. The baby settled again, cradled in Adrian's arms, his breaths evening out, though still occasionally strained from the cabin pressure. Adrian stared at the seat back ahead, trying to center his thoughts, but Ethan's voice replayed in his mind like an echo trapped in a metal room. "We can't have passengers bringing unsafe tools." It had been more than regulation. It had been personal. And then came the parting words, the real warning. "Let's see how safe you really are." At the time, it had felt like a passive-aggressive jab, but now, isolated in the hum of the cabin, it rang with something more threatening, something cold. A steward doesn't usually walk away after losing control, unless he's preparing to reclaim it. Adrian's fingers tensed over the armrest, every instinct sharpened. He scanned the cabin, not in panic, but preparation. Whatever Ethan had meant by those words, it wasn't routine. It wasn't about safety protocol, it was about dominance, and Ethan had just been challenged by someone who wouldn't bend. The air was calm, but a storm was already forming inside one man's mind. Adrian's fingers tightened slightly around the fabric of the baby blanket as Ethan Merrow's shadow fell once again across his row. The attendant moved with an unnatural calm, measured steps, hands folded behind his back, his eyes cool and scanning. It wasn't just routine now, it was deliberate. Each time Malik so much as whimpered, Ethan seemed to pass by, lingering just long enough for Adrian to notice the narrowing of his gaze, the faint clenching of his jaw. Malik shifted restlessly in Adrian's arms, his small face scrunched in discomfort. The change in cabin pressure was clearly bothering him. His recent surgery had left him more sensitive than other children, and Adrian had done everything to prepare, except, it seemed, for this. He rocked the baby gently and pressed a soft kiss to his temple, whispering reassurances only a father would understand. Leaning over the aisle slightly, Adrian raised a hand. "Excuse me," he called toward the galley. "May I have a cup of warm water, please?" Just to help my son with the pressure, Ethan stood near the coffee service, arms crossed. He looked directly at Adrian, his face unreadable, then turned away as though the request hadn't reached him. A moment passed, then another. Adrian glanced down at Malik, whose eyes were shut tight, a faint moan escaping his lips. Just as Adrian was about to stand, another attendant, Carter Doyle, approached from the opposite side of the cabin. The younger man glanced toward Ethan, hesitated, and then quickly bent down beside Adrian. Back in the cabin, Adrian felt Malik stir again. A soft whimper escaped the child's lips. He shifted in his father's arms, restless. Adrian reached for the small metal straw, custom-fitted and pediatrician-approved, and gently placed it near Malik's mouth. The baby latched on instinctively, sipping slowly. And at that exact moment, Ethan returned. He moved down the aisle at a measured pace, pausing once more at their row. His expression was unreadable, professional on the surface, but his eyes locked instantly onto the object in Adrian's hand. His voice was calm, but the undertone held a colder current. "Sir," he said, "I'll need to examine that item you're using." For safety compliance, Adrian blinked, caught off guard. "It's a sanitized hydration straw," he said again, holding it up gently. "It's medically necessary." "There's no hazard," Ethan nodded slowly, but not in agreement. "Regardless, I'll need to inspect it." "Policies require—" "There's no policy against a feeding straw," Adrian said, firm but respectful. "Please don't escalate something that isn't a risk." A pause. Ethan didn't respond. He looked at Adrian, then at Malik, then back again. His face remained still, but something shifted in his stance, a tightening of the jaw, a silent judgment. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. Adrian exhaled slowly, unsure of what exactly had just unfolded, but aware now that something was wrong. This wasn't just about a straw. This wasn't just about policy. There was a storm hiding beneath that uniform, waiting. Malik sipped quietly. The cabin lights dimmed further. Adrian leaned back, holding his son tightly. He had no idea that a simple act of care would turn into a battle for his child's life. Adrian Vance leaned forward slightly in his premium seat, carefully wiping down the plastic tray with a sanitizing wipe he had requested moments ago. The surface gave off a soft squeak as he scrubbed it, not out of paranoia, but precision, a habit formed from years of working in clean rooms and sterile labs. His son, Malik, lay across his lap, wrapped in a soft blanket with just the crown of his dark curls visible. The baby stirred lightly as the low rumble of the engines hummed beneath them. Behind Adrian, a voice cracked through the quiet cabin ambiance. "Some people think they own the sky," came the sharp whisper. It wasn't loud, but the weight behind the words was heavy. Ethan Merrow, one of the senior flight attendants, stood 2 rows back, leaning toward another crew member, his jaw tight and eyes fixed on Adrian. His colleague, Carter Doyle, let out a short, uneasy chuckle, not from agreement, but discomfort. Ethan didn't laugh. His stare lingered for a beat too long before he straightened his collar and moved briskly up the aisle, past rows of murmuring businessmen and tired travelers. His steps were crisp, practiced, too controlled. His polished shoes barely made a sound, but his presence left a wake. When he passed Adrian's row, he barely looked at him, but his eye twitched at the corner. That same metal wipe, that calm focus, the whole air of practiced perfection, unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite name. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Adrian reached down and retrieved a small stainless steel straw from the side pocket of his carry-on bag. It was sleek, compact, and thoroughly sanitized. He gently slid it into the mouth of a small insulated bottle and offered it to Malik, who began to suck weakly. The motion was slow, deliberate. Adrian tilted the bottle just right, his finger brushing lightly against Malik's cheek to soothe him. The baby had been through enough in recent weeks: hospital visits, nasal drainage tubes, and post-op recovery. This moment of quiet hydration was a practiced routine, essential to keeping the little one's nasal passages moist under the cabin's dry pressure. Ethan saw it. He paused mid-step in the aisle, his eyes narrowing like shutters closing. The gleam of metal caught the low cabin light, flashing faintly as Adrian adjusted the bottle. Ethan's lips parted slightly, then pressed together, his cheek twitching. He pivoted and walked back toward the galley, but not before muttering something to himself, low, clipped words that vanished into the engine's background noise. Moments later, he returned. His arms were folded across his chest, his smile forced like a crease ironed into stiff fabric. "Sir," he said, standing rigid beside Adrian's seat, "that item you're using, that's not an approved cabin tool." Adrian turned, his voice calm but firm. "It's a medical necessity. My son recently had nasal surgery. The metal straw helps regulate flow when he sips. It's clean. I assure you Ethan didn't move." His eyes darted to the child, then back to the bottle. "We have safety protocols about sharp or unauthorized metallic items. I'd like to take it and have it stored until landing." "Here," Carter whispered, carefully placing a small paper cup in the side compartment. His voice was low, conspiratorial. "Don't draw his attention." Adrian blinked. "What?" But Carter had already moved on, smile pasted on as he greeted another passenger a few rows back. Adrian stared after him, unsettled, but then looked down at Malik, who stirred again. The momentary confusion faded beneath concern as he focused on the baby. He dipped the corner of a cloth into the warm water and gently pressed it to Malik's lips. The hum of the engine filled the air. Conversations had lulled, passengers resting or scrolling silently through their screens. But Adrian felt it. Something beneath the surface. Something off. He didn't have to wait long. A soft voice broke the moment. "Still having trouble?" Adrian looked up. Ethan stood beside him, a tight-lipped smile carved into his face. His tone was light, but the edges of his words were too sharp. Adrian opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say a word, Ethan's hand darted forward. In a sudden, calculated motion, he snatched the metal straw from the tray beside Adrian's seat. "Excuse me," Adrian said sharply, rising a few inches in his seat, cradling Malik closer. "That's a medical device." Ethan held it up as though examining a piece of contraband. "It's a safety hazard," he declared flatly. "Sharp edges." "Not airline approved." "It's sterile," Adrian replied, trying to remain composed. "It's used under my doctor's recommendation." "My son has—" "I don't care what it's for," Ethan cut in, his false smile vanishing as quickly as it had come. His fingers closed tighter around the straw. "You should have asked permission before bringing personal instruments on board." Adrian's voice lowered, eyes narrowing. "Give it back." Now around them, passengers began to stir. A few lifted their heads, sensing the tension. A businessman across the aisle paused his typing. A young man near the window nudged his earbuds loose. Ethan leaned slightly forward, his voice quieter now. "I've seen men like you. Think the rules don't apply because you have a title, a badge, or a fancy coat." Adrian's brow furrowed. "This isn't about rules. This is about my child's health." "You've made your point." Ethan didn't move. His eyes burned with something darker than irritation, something colder. Adrian's instincts, sharpened by years in high-pressure labs and emergency rooms, flared. The man in front of him wasn't just enforcing protocol, he was provoking something. Adrian reached out, calm but firm, his fingers extending toward the straw still in Ethan's grip. For a second, their hands nearly touched. Then Ethan stepped back. "Sit down, sir," he said, raising his voice just enough for others to hear. "This is for everyone's safety." Malik let out a sharp cry, startled by the sound. Adrian pulled him closer, shielding his head. His own heartbeat pounded behind his ears. Carter, returning from the aft cabin, paused mid-step. His eyes flicked between the two men. His jaw tensed, but he said nothing. Ethan turned and walked away, the metal straw still in hand, his shoulders squared in grim satisfaction. Adrian watched him go, breath tight in his chest. He wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, to stand and reclaim what had been stolen. But something in Ethan's posture warned him that this wasn't over, that this act wasn't just about control. It was a message, and it had been sent. He sat back down slowly, brushing Malik's cheek with the back of his knuckle. The child was fussing again, distressed by the noise and pressure. Adrian's eyes flicked to the forward cabin where Ethan had disappeared. He stared for a long time, his thoughts no longer on warm water or airline policy. He was calculating, preparing, watching for the next move. Because now he understood. This wasn't just a man with a bad attitude. This was a man looking for a moment to break. And Adrian feared that moment was coming soon. Sometimes, a man's silence hides a scream waiting to escape. Ethan's hand moved before anyone could process what was happening. With chilling precision, he lunged forward and gripped baby Malik under the pretense of a health check. "Just checking his breathing," he muttered, voice too calm, too rehearsed. The lie passed his lips as his hands closed around the infant's face. Dr. Adrian Vance shot up from his seat, alarm flaring in his eyes. "Stop! What are you doing?" he shouted, reaching to pull his son back. But it was too late. In one horrifying, fluid motion, Ethan took the very same metal straw he had confiscated earlier, the one Adrian had explained was medically approved, and rammed it upward into the baby's nostril. There was no hesitation, no warning, just a sickening force, a sudden jerk, and a scream that tore through the pressurized cabin like a blade. Malik's cry was raw and high-pitched, the kind that shattered silence and sent ice through the spine. Blood poured instantly from his nose, painting his cheeks and chin in streaks of red. The world froze. Then chaos broke. "No! No, no, no! What did you do?" Adrian roared, wrenching his son from Ethan's hands. The baby convulsed in his arms, writhing in pain, tiny limbs flailing. Adrian pressed Malik close, shielding his face with trembling hands. "He hurt him! He hurt my child!" His voice cracked, half fury, half disbelief. Gasps rippled through the cabin like a wave. A man in row 2 fumbled with his seatbelt, mouth open in horror. Another clutched his chest, eyes wide as if trying to confirm this wasn't a nightmare. A boy near the bulkhead began to cry. Phones appeared in shaky hands, recording the aftermath in fractured angles and disjointed audio. Ethan stood rooted in place, face blank, shoulders stiff. A bead of sweat traced the edge of his brow, but he didn't move to help or speak. For a moment, his expression flickered, something between regret and confusion, but pride quickly replaced it. His jaw tightened. He stood taller, as if trying to reclaim authority over the very scene he had detonated. The intercom crackled above them, the captain's voice strained and sharp. "Flight crew, prepare for immediate cabin control. Everyone stay calm, remain seated." But no one was calm. The cabin had transformed. It wasn't a plane anymore, it was a courtroom of shock, a place where passengers became witnesses and silence became judgment. Every breath Adrian took was ragged. The weight of Malik's blood against his shirt felt like fire on his chest. Adrian's eyes burned with something ancient and unyielding. He was no longer just a doctor, no longer just a passenger. In that moment, with his injured son cradled in his arms, he became something else entirely. The fierce protectiveness of a father overtook the rationality of a man trained in science. He looked down at Malik, then up at Ethan. The distance between them was only a few steps, but it felt like the space between justice and cruelty. Carter Doyle, another flight attendant, appeared at the aisle's edge, eyes wide and horrified. "Ethan," he stammered, inching forward, "what did you do?" But Ethan didn't reply. His lips trembled for a moment, but no sound came. He backed up a step, bumping into the service cart behind him. The clang of metal trays echoed like a bell toll. Adrian took a single step forward, his voice low and shaking. "You assaulted my child." "You attacked a baby," Ethan finally responded, though his voice barely carried. "I thought he was choking." "I was trying to help." "Don't," Adrian interrupted sharply, eyes blazing. "Don't lie." In the corner of the cabin, someone whispered, "He shoved that thing in on purpose." Another voice answered, "That baby was crying, not choking." I saw it. The air grew thick, pressurized not by altitude but by judgment. Every man who witnessed the act now stared at Ethan like a verdict waiting to be handed down. Even the hum of the engines seemed to dim, as if the plane itself understood the gravity of what had occurred. Adrian turned toward the aisle briefly, as if considering his options, but there was no choice to be made. He wouldn't wait for officials or for airline apologies. He had one responsibility now: make Ethan face what he'd done. The fury bubbling in his chest was no longer containable. The blood on his son's face was not just an injury. It was a demand. For acknowledgement. For reckoning. The captain repeated his announcement, this time with urgency. "This aircraft is diverting. We are initiating emergency landing protocol." But it no longer mattered where the plane landed. What mattered had already happened. Ethan remained frozen, too proud to admit guilt, too fearful to offer help. The damage was done, and the world had seen it. Adrian clutched Malik tighter, his hand trembling as he brushed blood away from the infant's trembling lips. His voice dropped to a whisper, meant only for his son. "I've got you, Malik. No one will ever hurt you again." And as he turned slowly to face the man who had caused this, his expression calm, his purpose clear, there was no need for threats, no need for further words. Because in the silence that followed, everyone aboard knew what had happened. They had seen it, and no explanation could ever erase the image of a baby screaming in pain from a stranger's cruelty. The moment justice demanded blood, a father answered with fury. Ethan stepped back, trembling as the sound of collective outrage swelled around him like a rising tide. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary in the sky. It had transformed into a pressure cooker of panic and disbelief. His hands hovered mid-air, stained faintly with Malik's blood, shaking uncontrollably. Faces stared at him in disbelief. Phones pointed, mouths open, brows furrowed. Some passengers yelled, others sat frozen, horrified, unsure if they had truly witnessed what just happened. Carter Doyle, the junior flight attendant, rushed from the galley. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Ethan, stop! What have you done?" His eyes darted from the bleeding child to his unhinged colleague, disbelief written across every line of his face. But Ethan didn't hear him. His mind had already detached from the present. He stood there, mumbling in a near whisper, They think they're above everyone. Rules don't apply to them. Discipline matters. Entitlement everywhere. The words were fragmented, disconnected, the babble of a man trying to shield himself from the magnitude of his actions. Adrian's breath came fast and shallow, each inhale sharp with grief and fury. The image of Malik's wounded face, streaked in blood and writhing in silent cries, blotted out everything else. His hands shook as he tore off the seatbelt, eyes wide, movements clumsy but urgent. Every trained instinct as a doctor was overwhelmed by something deeper, something rawer. He pulled tissues from the seat pocket and pressed them gently against his son's face, whispering words that could barely find their voice. "It's okay. I've got you. It's going to stop, I swear." Malik whimpered, a soft and broken sound that felt louder than any scream. Blood oozed around the edges of the tissue. Adrian adjusted the pressure, careful but desperate, trying to halt the flow. The baby's chest rose and fell too quickly. His pain was silent, his eyes wide with confusion. Adrian knew the nose was delicate, and that the damage Ethan had inflicted went far deeper than skin. Panic fought its way into his mind, but he shoved it down. He needed to stay alert, for Malik. All around them, the cabin fell into disarray. 2 rows behind, a man stood up with his phone, recording everything. A woman across the aisle sobbed into her hands. Someone shouted toward the cockpit, "We need a doctor or medical landing now." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, firm but uneasy. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are initiating an emergency descent. Remain calm and stay seated. Medical personnel will be waiting upon arrival." But calm was long gone. Ethan shifted uneasily near the galley as if trapped in a shrinking box. His mouth opened, lips dry, his voice brittle. It was an accident, I thought. He was choking. I didn't. But the words fell flat. He looked around for sympathy and found only condemnation. Carter, who had once seen Ethan as meticulous if not difficult, now saw something unrecognizable. He stood between Ethan and the nearest passenger, unsure if he needed to restrain his coworker or shield him from the wrath of the cabin. Adrian raised his head. His eyes locked with Ethan's. What had once been the thoughtful gaze of a scholar now burned with a father's fury, unfiltered, unmeasured, and absolute. There was no sound in his voice, yet it roared with meaning. Ethan's breath hitched, taking a step back as though physically struck. The doctor didn't speak, but the look alone told him everything. No more words, no more excuses, no more protection. The passengers began to whisper, many now standing. A voice muttered, "He did that on purpose." Another, "He hurt a baby. He hurt that man's baby." The collective judgment became a wall Ethan could not scale. He was surrounded by the consequences of his actions, cornered by panic, shame, and the raw truth of what he had done. He reached out as if to explain again, but no one was listening. Adrian looked down at Malik, whose small body had curled toward his chest, exhausted and trembling. The tissues were soaked now. He would need proper care, real care. He had to survive. Adrian cradled him closer, shielding him from the chaos. The father's body formed a barrier, a quiet promise of protection forged in blood and resolve. Carter stepped forward again, lowering his voice but keeping it firm. "We're landing soon. Help is coming. Just stay with him." Adrian nodded silently, never taking his eyes off his son. The plane's descent began to tilt, cabin pressure shifting as trays clinked and overhead lights flickered slightly. The world felt like it was falling, fitting, somehow, after the fall that had just occurred inside this flying chamber. Ethan slumped back against the side panel, eyes darting in every direction for a way out, for someone to tell him he hadn't gone too far. But no one came. Even Carter avoided his gaze now. Ethan's breathing was ragged, and he mumbled to himself again, about rules, about fairness, about how he was just doing what he thought was right. But the words had no air behind them. only guilt. Adrian looked up one last time, his jaw clenched tight. Whatever came next, he would face it. But in that moment, something had changed. The man who boarded the plane as a careful father and quiet professional had vanished. In his place stood someone sharper, someone who had crossed the point of no return. The scholar had disappeared. What remained was something ancient, unrelenting, and shaped by love and fury. The cabin descended into silence, as if the plane itself recognized the weight of what had been unleashed. When reason dies, rage becomes its language. Adrian rose from his seat without hesitation, feet finding the aisle with a quiet authority that made heads turn. He did not speak. There was no need. He extended Malik toward the nearest passenger with a single, steady hand. "Hold him, please," he said, and the words landed like a command. The man across the aisle, wide-shouldered, breathless from shock, took the baby with trembling hands, eyes darting between the tiny, blood-streaked face and Adrian's unblinking stare. Around them, the cabin vibrated with a dozen half-voices, the soft whine of air circulation suddenly loud, the overhead bins humming like a distant crowd. Adrian's tone was calm, but there was a hardness in it that chilled the space between rows. Ethan stumbled back, instinct and disbelief colliding on his face. He tried to shape an excuse, something about protocol, about safety, but the words came out thin and small against the weight of what he had done. Passengers craned their necks, phones raised, the cold blue of screens catching in everyone's eyes. The man who had minutes earlier moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency now looked overwhelmed, vulnerable in a way that begged for mercy. Adrian's face softened for no one. He stepped forward. He did not shout. He did not plead. His palm closed on Ethan's uniform collar with a grip that was both surgical and merciless. The movement was controlled, no wasted motion, as if guided by years of steady hands accustomed to operating under pressure. Adrian's fingers curled into fabric, and with one measured shove he slammed Ethan against the galley door. The metal frame thudded under the force, and for a heartbeat the only sound was the creak of the latch and Malik's distant, muffled cry from the stranger's arms. Adrian's jaw worked. Each breath he took sounded deliberate and slow, like a man harnessing adrenaline into purpose. "You hurt my son," he said, voice low and precise. The words were not a question. Ethan's eyes went wide and glassy. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried to twist away. Adrian tightened his hold. The flight attendants and a few passengers moved forward, hands raised as if to separate two boiling pots, but none dared break the current of energy between the two men. Carter's face was a pale oval of regret at the edge of the scene, his mouth moving without sound. Adrian's hand found the metal straw in Ethan's still-clenched fist. For a second he simply stared down at it. An ordinary thing, slender and cold, and saw in it the moment when a fragile life had been violated. The straw looked fragile enough to bend, absurd enough to be harmless. And yet, at that instant, it carried all the severity of the damage it had done. Adrian's mind moved with exact, unavoidable logic. The object that had been used to harm would be returned to the one who had swung it. He pressed the straw toward Ethan's face. Not with a showman's flourish, but with the same calm, purposeful pressure he had used in an operating room when steady hands made the difference between life and death. Ethan's features contorted in shock and then in pain. He let out a raw, involuntary cry that cut the air. Passengers recoiled as if struck. Some turned their faces away, unable to watch the scene they had all recorded seconds before. The hum of the engines swelled and faded like a heartbeat as the cabin took in what was happening, an act of justice or vengeance, the line between them thin and dangerous. Adrian's breath trembled only once, a shadow of the fury contained beneath. His palms remained steady. The flight attendant who had tried to maintain decorum now sat slumped, hand over his mouth, eyes luminous with disbelief. Around them, the murmur rose and fell. Soft sobs, stammers, The distant click of a camera stilled as its owner realized the gravity of what they had captured. Adrian's chest moved with a slow, controlled rise and fall. He felt the heat of blood on his shirt where Malik's small body had pressed against him, and the metallic tang was a steady reminder of why he had acted. When he finally loosened his grip and let go, it was not with triumph. Ethan slumped forward, clutching his face where the straw had pressed, tears mingling with the sweat on his brow. He made no more arguments. He made no more claims of protocol or panic. In the hush that followed, Adrian stepped back, eyes sweeping over the faces around him, some angry, some horrified, some numb. He folded his hands once against his chest as if to return them to their rightful work, then turned to the man holding Malik. The infant's breaths were shallow and uneven, but he was breathing. Adrian's fingers brushed his son's tiny forehead with a tenderness that contradicted the violence that had just unfolded. He whispered something small and private, an apology, a promise, a vow, words too soft to be caught by the thrumming cabin. Then he straightened, shoulders squared against the sudden glare of attention, and let the noise of the plane come back to him. The rustle of newspapers, a child's frightened whimper, the distant murmur of crew voices coordinating beyond the compact battlefield they had occupied. Even in that charged silence, a different sound edged forward. The low, steady click of seatbelts being fastened, the captain's voice on the intercom preparing for an unscheduled descent. The world shifted, as it always did, forcing motion after stasis. Adrian remained where he was, a man who had crossed from healer to avenger in a single, impossible instant. He felt the consequences settling around him like dust, inescapable, heavy, inevitable. He had done what he had to do, and now the next part of the world's response would fall into place. Retribution isn't spoken, it's felt. He jammed a metal straw into a baby's nose, drawing blood and silence across the cabin. The father's calm broke, and justice rose in his eyes. If you believe no act of violence should go unanswered, hit subscribe now. Carter Doyle was the first to react. As the stunned silence in the cabin cracked under the rising wave of gasps and cries, he lunged forward from the jump seat, reaching Adrian just as two male passengers pushed past the galley curtain. Adrian didn't flinch when Carter grabbed his arm. His hands, no longer clenched with fury, were relaxed now, steady, almost surgical in their release. The moment Ethan crumpled to the floor, his hands covering the crimson smear on his face, Adrian stepped back as if the violence had drained from him entirely. Ethan let out a sharp cry, not just of pain, but of disbelief. Blood seeped from the shallow puncture along the side of his nose and cheek, warm rivulets trailing toward his trembling lips. His breathing turned ragged, somewhere between a sob and a gasp, as he collapsed into the narrow space beside the beverage cart. His hands fumbled to wipe away the blood, but his fingers shook uncontrollably. His uniform shirt, once crisp and tucked, was wrinkled and stained. His eyes were wild, darting between faces that no longer offered him the comfort of authority, only judgment. Malik whimpered. The soft, broken sound of the infant's cry pierced through the static stillness. The stranger who had held him, an older man in a navy sweater, stood near the aisle, his hands visibly trembling as he cradled the child against his chest. His voice was low, unsure. I think he needs you," he said, as if asking permission to let go. Adrian moved toward him without a word, his limbs stiff with restraint as if holding back another surge of rage. He took Malik into his arms gently, clutching his son close. The child's tiny hands pressed weakly against his chest, seeking comfort, warmth, familiarity. Adrian bent his head, brushing his lips against Malik's damp forehead. "It's over," he whispered, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "It's over." The baby's soft breathing quivered against his shirt, his nose still bleeding faintly. Adrian pulled a cloth from his coat pocket, one he always kept for emergencies, and dabbed carefully at the wound. Malik winced but didn't cry. That silence hurt worse than any scream. Over the intercom, the captain's voice finally returned, brittle and urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are declaring a medical emergency and diverting to Norham Field. Please remain seated and follow instructions." The message was delivered with military precision, but behind it lurked panic. The cockpit had likely seen nothing, heard only fragments, but they knew enough to fear what awaited on the ground. In the galley, Ethan hadn't moved much. He sat against the metal cabinet, knees pulled up, face buried in his palms. Blood continued to stain his fingers. Every few seconds his shoulders shook with short, involuntary spasms. Carter knelt across from him, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and fury. "You did this," Carter said, his voice low but sharp. "You crossed a line no one can defend." Ethan slowly looked up, his eyes glassy and wet. He attacked me," he croaked, though even he didn't seem to believe it. Carter didn't blink. "You jammed a metal straw into a baby's face, Ethan." Ethan's lips parted, as if to offer another excuse, but nothing came. He stared ahead now, toward the bulkhead, where a single passenger was still recording on his phone. There was no hiding anymore. The damage was done, not just to a child, but to something deeper, something irreversible. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, some shielding their children's eyes, others passing tissues down the rows. A young man in a tan hoodie stood near the lavatory, arms crossed, watching Adrian. He didn't say a word, but his gaze was filled with something fierce. Maybe respect, maybe sorrow. Adrian sat down again, gently rocking Malik as the baby leaned heavily against his shoulder. The seatbelt light flashed red, and flight attendants began checking passengers, though most were too stunned to respond. One man wept quietly into his hands. Another muttered a prayer under his breath. Carter remained in the galley, watching Ethan like a guard beside a fallen prisoner. The silence between them was heavy, loaded with everything that could no longer be undone. Adrian glanced toward the window, but saw only the distant cloud cover. His mind, however, was locked inside the metal shell of the cabin, replaying the moment Ethan's hand had grabbed his son, the gleam of cruelty in his eye, the blood. That image would not leave him. He looked down at Malik again, breathing in his scent, letting the rhythm of the baby's breath steady his own pulse. The plane had become a sanctuary and a battlefield all at once, and now it was simply a vessel heading toward judgment. Somewhere far off, the pilot was speaking to ground control, preparing for emergency responders, but inside the aircraft, no words felt adequate anymore. There was only aftermath. As the aircraft descended, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, the way they do before landing. But in the hearts of those who witnessed it, the descent had already begun long ago, when humanity had been tested, and someone failed the measure. Ethan curled tighter into himself, letting out a soft, muffled sob. Carter didn't move. He just stared. The father and the flight attendant sat in silence, separated by everything that defines right and wrong. When justice bleeds, it stains everyone it touches. The wheels screeched against the tarmac as the plane touched down at Norham Field Airport, the force of the emergency landing jolting passengers forward in their seats. Inside the cabin, the tension was still thick, unbroken by the smooth descent. Adrian Vance gripped his son tightly, the small bundle of Malik's wounded body wrapped in a blanket that could not hide the blood seeping through. His mind raced, clinging to control, whispering his son's name like a lifeline. The moment the aircraft halted, sirens wailed outside, flashing red and blue against the windows. Emergency vehicles surrounded the plane, their urgency a mirror of Adrian's own. The cabin door opened with a mechanical hiss, and the air that rushed in was colder than expected. 2 paramedics boarded first, stepping over discarded food trays and bags left behind in the panic. Their eyes locked instantly on Adrian, crouched near seat 3A, his shirt stained crimson, his arms cradling Malik as if letting go might make the world unravel. One paramedic, a tall man with a lined face and gray at his temples, knelt beside him. "We need to take him now," he said gently, voice steady but urgent. Adrian didn't respond at first. He held on tighter. "He's breathing, but his nose won't stop," Adrian muttered almost to himself. "He needs a specialist, someone who understands nasal trauma in infants. Please, please be careful. We've got him," the second paramedic said, younger but just as focused. "You can stay close. We'll move together." Adrian reluctantly eased his arms away, watching every motion as they transferred Malik onto a pediatric stretcher fitted with stabilizers. The boy whimpered but didn't scream, his small face still blotched with blood and saline. Adrian stood immediately, following the stretcher down the aisle, but just before reaching the door, he turned. Ethan Merrow was being pulled toward the rear of the cabin by two uniformed officers, his wrists locked in handcuffs. "This is insane," Ethan shouted, face twisted in disbelief and fear. "I was assaulted. I was doing my job. You hurt that baby," someone snapped from the seats behind him. Another passenger raised a phone. "I recorded everything," the man said, voice sharp. "Tell your lawyer to get ready." Ethan's eyes darted around, searching for support, but found none. Carter Doyle stood near the galley, arms crossed tightly across his chest. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it sliced through the noise. "You did this. You crossed a line no one can defend." Ethan fell silent, lips trembling but no words forming. The officers tightened their hold and moved him down the narrow aisle. Outside, on the jet bridge, more responders waited, some with stretchers, others with notepads, cameras already rolling as reporters gathered behind the security line. The moment Adrian stepped off the plane, a flood of flashing lights met him. Microphones waved. A voice shouted, "Sir, what happened on board?" But Adrian ignored it all. His eyes never left the stretcher ahead of him. Every step felt like walking through a nightmare that refused to end. On the tarmac, the full chaos revealed itself. Paramedic teams shouting codes, police officers marking off areas, airport security coordinating crowd control. Adrian moved with tunnel vision, brushing past a reporter who tried to thrust a recorder in front of his face. Inside the terminal, Malik was wheeled directly into a waiting ambulance. Adrian climbed in after him, placing a protective hand on his son's tiny foot as the doors slammed shut. Through the tinted windows he could still see Ethan, now surrounded by police officers and aviation security. One camera zoomed in on Adrian's bloodied shirt, another on the tear in his sleeve where he'd slammed Ethan into the galley door. As the ambulance began to roll, Adrian leaned closer to Malik, brushing the child's damp forehead with the back of his fingers. "It's going to be all right," he whispered, though his voice wavered. "They won't touch you again. No one will hurt you again." Meanwhile, officers began taking witness statements on the runway. Several passengers came forward immediately, playing back phone footage that clearly captured Ethan's aggression, the cold approach, the forceful act, the aftermath. The captain, standing near the bottom of the stair truck, looked pale, sweat soaking through the collar of his uniform. He offered his account stiffly to a detective with a notepad, aware that this flight would not be remembered for any scheduled route but for what unfolded in row 3A. As the ambulance disappeared into the distance, the mood on the runway shifted from chaos to stunned silence. The reporters had what they needed. The passengers, still reeling, were escorted to a private terminal for debriefing. But the story was already writing itself. Feeds were lighting up with cell phone footage, headlines forming in real time. Flight attendant attacks, infant mid-flight, doctor fights back, emergency landing after onboard assault. At the hospital, Adrian stayed by Malik's side as the pediatric team worked quickly, confirming what he had prayed for. No permanent damage, though the trauma would take time to heal. Adrian slumped into the chair beside the hospital bed, the weight of everything crashing over him. His hands still shook as he looked down at the blood drying across his palms and shirt front. He thought about the courtroom he would eventually have to enter, the explanations he would have to give, and the pictures that would haunt him for years. But all of that could wait. For now, his son was alive. Back on the tarmac, the last passengers were finally escorted away, and the emergency crews began to withdraw. Ethan, now in the back of a police cruiser, stared at the airport lights fading in the distance, his world shrinking by the second. For Adrian, however, the world was opening again, not into peace, but into purpose. Sometimes, justice lands faster than any plane. The hospital room buzzed with the soft, mechanical rhythm of machines, the steady beep of a heart monitor, the occasional hiss of an oxygen valve releasing air, and the whisper of nurses' shoes brushing over polished floors. Adrian Vance sat motionless in the stiff vinyl chair beside his son's bed, his spine curved forward in a quiet shield of protection. Malik, just over a year old, lay bundled in a thin hospital blanket, his small face pale against the stark white of the pillow. Tiny bandages ran beneath his nostrils, concealing the sutures and swelling. Every so often his chest would rise with a gentle wheeze, the sound slicing through Adrian's resolve like a blade. The fluorescent ceiling lights reflected in Adrian's weary eyes. He hadn't changed out of the shirt he'd worn on the plane, though now the dried blood on it had browned and stiffened. He hadn't left the room since they arrived. Doctors came and went. Nurses murmured in hushed tones. But Adrian didn't move, not unless Malik stirred. Then his hand would reach forward instinctively, offering the lightest touch to comfort him, or a whispered reassurance that barely reached the walls. Each hour blurred into the next. There was no day or night anymore, just time measured in shallow breaths and medical updates. Outside the hospital walls, the world was exploding with outrage. Reporters swarmed the sidewalks. News stations cycled the same grainy footage taken by passengers, Ethan's rigid frame, the flash of movement, Malik's scream, the chaos. Headlines screamed across every major outlet. Flight attendant attacks, infant mid-flight. Adrian barely glanced at the news, but he didn't need to. The hospital staff treated him differently now, respectfully, yes, but cautiously. Some seemed afraid to disturb him, as if he carried lightning beneath his skin. Others offered silent gestures of support, a coffee left on the window ledge, a blanket folded across the foot of the bed. The world had formed an opinion without him saying a word, but Adrian knew silence could be mistaken for surrender. And he was not surrendering. When a nurse entered quietly to check Malik's IV line, Adrian finally stirred. He stood up, stretched his back with a groan, and stepped into the hallway. His phone buzzed in his pocket again. Missed calls, messages, news alerts. He scrolled through them absently until a familiar name caught his eye. Leon Graves. Leon was an investigative journalist Adrian had met years ago during a medical ethics case. They'd stayed in touch occasionally, trading articles and stories over coffee. Adrian stared at the message for a moment, then called. "Adrian," Leon answered on the first ring, voice sharp but controlled. "I saw the footage." "I'm so sorry, man. What do you need?" "I need people to know the truth," Adrian replied, his voice low but unwavering. "Not just about Ethan. About what this represents." There was a pause. "You have footage? Passenger videos? Medical records? Photos of Malik's injuries? Everything. I'm coming to you," Leon said. "I'll be there in 2 hours." True to his word, Leon arrived that afternoon, slipping past the reporters outside under a hoodie and worn jeans. He met Adrian in a small conference room the hospital offered for legal consultations. Adrian handed over a folder, paper documents, a flash drive, screenshots. Leon flipped through the records in silence, his face darkening with each turn. "They called this an unforeseen altercation," he muttered, reading the airline's public statement. "They tried to bury it under language." "I won't let them," Adrian said. His voice shook, not with fear, but with restrained fire. Leon nodded. "Give me 12 hours. This won't be buried. I promise you that. That night, while Malik slept under the watchful eyes of his nurses, Leon's story hit the front page of multiple outlets. Infant assaulted, mid-flight. Cover-up exposed by father's evidence. The article detailed everything: Ethan's history of complaints, Adrian's background, the medical necessity of the straw, and the airline's cold, clinical response. Public reaction was immediate and fierce. Social media erupted. Ethan's name became synonymous with cruelty. Defenders fell silent. Petitions demanded the airline's accountability. Senators tweeted about launching aviation policy reviews. Strangers sent messages of support, some offering legal aid, others simply sharing prayers. But Adrian didn't bask in the attention. He remained beside Malik, reading him stories in a low voice, holding his fingers while he slept, speaking to him in the language only a father and son could understand. The nurses noticed that Adrian never left the room for more than a few minutes. One of them, a quiet man named Jonah, offered kind words during a night shift. "He's strong," Jonah said softly as he checked Malik's chart. "So are you." Adrian nodded, offering a tight smile. But the weight in his chest didn't ease. He wasn't waiting for headlines to change. He was waiting for his son to open his eyes without pain. Late one night, as rain tapped against the window glass, Adrian leaned forward and whispered near Malik's ear. His voice trembled, filled with something deeper than hope, something like a vow. "You'll breathe freely again, my boy." I promise you that the courtroom was already filled when Adrian stepped through the double doors. The low murmur of voices ceased the moment he entered, and every head turned, as if the presence of the man at the center of the storm had shifted the air. He walked slowly, deliberately, each footstep echoing across the marble floor like the ticking of a countdown. In his right hand, he held a small wooden pendant, dark mahogany, worn smooth over generations. It had belonged to Malik's grandfather, a man who had taught Adrian that strength wasn't in how loud you spoke, but in how long you stood when others fell. The pendant rested against his palm like a steady heartbeat. Adrian moved past the benches and toward the front, where the plaintiff's table waited for him. His attorney, Marcus Eldon, a tall man with sharp features and a calm presence, nodded once in silent acknowledgement. Adrian returned the gesture, eyes never drifting from the bench where Ethan Merrow sat. Ethan looked nothing like the man from that flight. The crisp uniform had been replaced by a gray suit that didn't fit quite right, too loose in the shoulders, too tight at the collar. His face, though no longer freshly wounded, bore the uneven reminders of Adrian's fury. A pale scar stretched across his cheek like a question left unanswered. He avoided Adrian's gaze, focusing instead on the table before him, where papers were arranged too neatly to be anything but a distraction. The judge, a stern-faced man named Harold Cromwell, banged the gavel once. "Court is now in session for the case of the state versus Ethan Merrow." Ethan's lawyer, Gregory Hance, rose to his feet with practiced calm. "Your Honor, the defense intends to prove that Mr. Merrow acted not out of malice, but under extreme stress. My client was placed in an untenable situation, expected to maintain control in a chaotic environment. He panicked, yes, but he did not intend to harm the child." Adrian remained still. His fingers gently closed around the pendant, grounding himself. Gregory's words were designed to shift the focus, to reframe the incident as an accident of pressure and misunderstanding. But Adrian knew the truth. So did the people in that cabin. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Lionel Craig, stood next. He was a compact man, unassuming at first glance, but his voice held the gravity of experience. "Your Honor," he began, "the prosecution will present footage taken by passengers. This footage will show not a man under stress, but a man whose actions were deliberate, calculated, and cruel. We will also present medical reports detailing the extensive injuries to the victim, an infant barely a year old. This was no lapse of judgment. This was assault." The lights dimmed slightly as the footage was cued on the large screen beside the jury box. The video began with Ethan standing by Adrian's seat, reaching without permission, snatching the metal straw from the tray. The murmurs in the room ceased completely. Then came the moment everyone knew was coming, the sudden, violent thrust of the straw into the baby's nose. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Even the jurors, seasoned and prepared, recoiled at the sound of Malik's scream. The courtroom was frozen in time. Ethan looked down, his face pale. Adrian didn't move, didn't blink. The video ended with Adrian's quiet voice. "You hurt my son." Craig turned toward the jury. That is the voice of a father, not a man seeking revenge, but a man watching the unthinkable happen to his child. And that, he pointed to the screen, is the voice of guilt, not panic. Next came the medical examiner, a soft-spoken doctor named Gerald Boone, who explained the extent of Malik's injuries. Broken capillaries, severe nasal trauma, risk of infection due to exposure. The words were clinical, but the jury could feel the weight behind them. This was not just injury. It was violence. Finally, it was Adrian's turn. He walked to the witness stand slowly, each step measured, his face unreadable. The bailiff swore him in, and Adrian sat, eyes level with the jury. "Dr. Vance," Craig said gently, "please tell the court what you saw that day." Adrian took a breath, steadying himself. "I saw a man," he began, "look at my child as if he were an object. I saw him ignore my requests, disregard my explanations, and eventually, I saw him grab my son and jam a metal straw into his nose." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I tried to stay calm. "I'm a doctor. I've been trained to handle emergencies. But nothing prepares you for the moment your child bleeds because someone chose cruelty over care." Craig stepped aside, giving Adrian space to continue. "He didn't panic," Adrian said, now looking directly at Ethan. "He watched me plead. He watched my son cry. And then he chose to hurt him. That was not instinct. That was intention." There was silence. Gregory Hance approached, clearly uncomfortable. "Dr. Vance, would you say your own response was fueled by anger?" "Yes," Adrian answered without hesitation. "It was. I was angry that someone thought they could harm my child and be protected by a uniform. You don't regret what you did?" Adrian turned his gaze to the jury. "I regret that it ever had to happen. But no man has the right to harm innocence and expect mercy." The courtroom doors creaked open, and a hush fell over the packed gallery. Every eye turned toward the jury box where 12 solemn faces betrayed the weight of the decision they were about to deliver. The judge, a silver-haired man with sharp brows and a deep voice that carried both authority and weariness, glanced toward the foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, a middle-aged man in a gray suit, stood and nodded. "We have, Your Honor." He passed a folded sheet of paper to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge without a word. The silence grew dense. Even the sound of shifting feet or shallow breathing seemed too loud in that moment. Adrian sat at the plaintiff's table, his back straight, hands clasped tightly in his lap. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat. Every moment of the past year, every beep of the hospital monitor, every press conference, every night watching over Malik's fragile sleep, converged in this one instant. Across the courtroom, Ethan sat rigidly beside his attorney, face pale, fingers trembling at his sides. The scars on his face had faded, but they had not softened the lines of defiance that still clung to his features. The judge read the verdict aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Merrow, guilty of aggravated assault and child endangerment." A gasp rose from the crowd, quickly followed by absolute stillness. Ethan's head dropped as if his body could no longer carry the weight of the words. Tears fell, silent and unacknowledged, onto the oak table in front of him. His attorney placed a firm hand on his shoulder, but Ethan didn't move. Adrian closed his eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't clench his fists or bow his head. He simply sat still, lips parting in a quiet breath as though releasing a truth too heavy to carry any longer. The judge continued, his voice echoing like thunder through the chamber. For the crime of aggravated assault against a minor and the willful endangerment of a child's life, this court hereby sentences the defendant to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. There was no applause, no cheer. The atmosphere held the weight of something sacred, something broken and now bound by the law's quiet hands. Adrian slowly stood, straightening his tie as if bracing against the rush of emotion that threatened to surface. He turned slightly, scanning the room. Some spectators wept. Others simply stared. The jury looked exhausted, as though each of them had lived through the story, not just judged it. As court officers moved toward Ethan, the flight attendant began to sob, deep, shuddering sobs that sounded less like remorse and more like the breaking of a man who had never thought consequences would come. Adrian didn't watch him being led away. He focused instead on the bench where Malik had sat a week earlier, drawing clumsy pictures with crayons during recesses in the trial. That image of his son drawing stars while adults argued over pain lingered in his mind like a quiet hymn. Outside the courthouse, the wind carried the scent of rain. Reporters had gathered like storm clouds. As Adrian stepped through the heavy wooden doors, the flash of cameras exploded in staccato bursts. Microphones shot forward like spears. "Dr. Vance, do you feel victorious today? What do you say to those who believe your actions went too far?" Adrian paused at the top of the steps. He looked tired, older than he had a year ago, but his posture held the quiet dignity of a man who had faced something unimaginable and survived. One reporter shouted above the noise, "Do you feel vindicated?" He turned toward the voice, the wind tugging gently at the corners of his coat. He looked down for a moment, then up at the crowd, eyes dark with exhaustion and conviction. "No father feels vindicated after blood has been spilled," he said softly, his voice cutting through the noise without force. "I only feel that the truth has been seen." The crowd quieted. Even the cameras paused, frozen in reverence. He walked down the steps slowly, not as a man stepping away from battle, but as one carrying the burden of what that battle had cost. In the days that followed, headlines blazed across screens and papers. "Guilty, flight attendant sentenced in infant assault case." The footage of the trial, now public, played on repeat. Ethan's face, pale, broken, became the symbol of unrepentant authority turned dangerous. And Adrian's calm voice, recorded outside the courtroom, sparked national discussion on justice, accountability, and the line between defense and vengeance. Behind the scenes, the airline's executive board faced a barrage of lawsuits and investigations. It was revealed that multiple complaints about Ethan's conduct had been ignored, buried under red tape and internal silence. The company scrambled to issue statements promising reform and transparency. Policies were torn down and rebuilt. Flight crews were retrained. A new department was created to review passenger grievances, this time with legal oversight. But Adrian didn't involve himself in any of it. He turned down television interviews, denied offers for book deals. He focused on Malik, on his recovery, on the laughter that slowly returned to his son's eyes. Their home became quiet again, filled not with worry but with small, precious moments, stacking wooden blocks, reading bedtime stories, watching planes fly overhead with no fear attached to their sound. He kept one photograph on his desk, a court sketch of the moment he took the stand. He didn't look at it often, but when he did, it reminded him not of the trial, but of the promise he made to his son while holding his bandaged hand in a hospital bed. "You'll breathe freely again, my boy." He had kept that promise. Justice doesn't erase scars, it teaches others where not to cut. The terminal's glass walls shimmered under the morning sun, casting long reflections across the polished floors. Adrian stepped into the bustling concourse, his coat brushing softly against his leg as he adjusted the weight of Malik on his hip. The boy's small hands clutched the edge of his father's collar, his eyes wide with curiosity as he took in the movement and color of the world around him. The hum of rolling suitcases, the echoes of boarding calls, and the faint scent of jet fuel all blended into a strangely comforting rhythm, one that Adrian had avoided for nearly a year. This was the same airport where his life had been fractured and remade, and every corner seemed to whisper fragments of the past. He moved slowly, not out of hesitation, but reverence. Each step through the terminal felt like walking through memory. Each announcement, each flight number, a reminder of the day everything had changed. Yet Malik's laughter pulled him back to the present. The boy giggled at the sight of a plane taxiing outside, the reflection of its wings glinting in his eyes. Adrian smiled faintly, his grip tightening protectively. "You like that one?" he murmured. Malik nodded, his voice a soft hum of excitement. "Plane," he whispered, the simple word carrying the innocence of a child who had endured far more than he could ever understand. Ahead, a crowd had gathered near Gate 12, where a large digital board displayed the words, "The Malik Vance Initiative for Airborne Safety and Compassion Training, Dedication Ceremony." The letters pulsed in blue and gold, drawing attention from travelers who paused to read the announcement. Adrian's breath caught slightly as he read his son's name. It wasn't pride that filled him. It was a quiet ache, the kind that comes from knowing that change had been born from pain. A young reporter approached him hesitantly, holding a microphone. "Dr. Vance? Could we have a few words before the ceremony begins?" Her tone was polite, cautious, as if afraid of reopening wounds. Adrian shook his head gently. "Not today," he said, his voice even but soft. "Today isn't about me." He turned away before she could ask another question. His eyes scanned the crowd until they found Carter Doyle standing near the stage. The former flight attendant looked older, wearier, his uniform replaced by a dark suit and a subdued tie. Still, when their eyes met, something wordless passed between them: gratitude, forgiveness, and the lingering bond of shared tragedy. As the ceremony began, the terminal's noise seemed to dim. A representative from the Civil Aviation Board took the stage, his deep voice echoing through the hall. "This initiative," he began, "is not only a commitment to safety, but a pledge to restore humanity to the skies." His words resonated through the chamber as images of new training programs flashed on a nearby screen. Crew members learning empathy, simulations of passenger care, procedures built around patience and understanding. Adrian watched silently, his mind drifting to that day on the plane. The sounds returned to him, the scream, the chaos, the heartbeat that had thundered louder than any engine. He blinked, grounding himself in the present. Carter stepped up to the podium next. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded a small piece of paper. "I was there that day," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "And I saw a man fight for his child with courage I'll never forget. I saw fear turn to justice and pain turn to purpose. What happened on that flight changed us all, but it also taught us how to be better." He paused, his gaze meeting Adrian's across the crowd. "This foundation exists because one father refused to let cruelty define the skies." The audience applauded softly, a ripple of emotion spreading through the gathered travelers. Adrian's throat tightened. He hadn't expected to be moved again, but hearing those words in public, a testament not to the violence, but to the compassion that followed, stirred something within him. He knelt briefly, adjusting Malik's small jacket. "You see that, Malik?" he whispered. "That's for you." The boy smiled up at him, oblivious to the gravity of his father's words, his tiny fingers tugging playfully at Adrian's tie. After the speeches ended, Adrian was invited to the stage to unveil the foundation's plaque. He hesitated for a heartbeat, the weight of memory pressing against his chest, then walked forward with calm dignity. The plaque gleamed under the lights, etched with the words, "In honor of every child who reminds us that kindness must never yield to cruelty." Adrian's hand lingered on the inscription. He didn't speak into the microphone. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was its own form of tribute. When the crowd began to disperse, Adrian stepped toward the glass wall of the terminal. Beyond it, a jet lifted from the runway, its engines roaring with life. The sound reverberated through the hall, deep and familiar. Malik pointed at it, his face glowing with wonder. "Plane go high," he exclaimed. Adrian's lips curved into a faint smile as he watched the ascent. In that single moment, he felt a rare peace, not because the past was gone, but because he had learned to carry it with grace. Carter approached quietly, stopping beside him. "It's good to see you here," he said, his voice low but sincere. "You could have stayed away." Adrian looked at him for a long moment, then replied, "Some places stop being haunted once you decide to rebuild them." Carter nodded, understanding. There was nothing more to say. The sunlight shifted, spilling gold across the terminal floor. Adrian turned toward the window again, holding his son a little closer. His reflection in the glass showed a man forever changed, not broken, but reshaped by the weight of compassion and endurance. "The sky belongs to no one, but kindness should rule it," he whispered. Malik smiled, pointing at the plane, unaware of the history that gave him a safer world. From pain rose the wings of change. He scarred a baby's face with pain, never imagining his own would soon mirror it. Subscribe now if you stand for protecting the innocent and holding monsters accountable, because justice never sleeps. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of racism, cruelty, and the swift consequences of arrogance and prejudice. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire empathy, justice, and accountability in the face of discrimination.